Oye, 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 espérate y espérame. Pero vamos a hablar inglés.
No me llama Carlos, ese no es mi nombre, ahora es un cocotazo. Tienes que entender que soy muy digno, muchacho. Me da pique porque para ti soy un fracaso. Me da pique porque para los hombres soy Pegaso. Me da pique porque transfo y sobrepaso. Me da pique porque ellos son carrasco. Me da pique porque ellos son carrasco. Un carrasco, dale fuetazo. Un carrasco, dale fuetazo.
¿Qué lo que, mi gente? Welcome back to another episode of the VAMOS HABLAR INGLÉS Podcast. I'm your host, REINA TAÍNA, and we are entering our little winter season right now. How are y'all doing? Happy holidays and happy new year. We're recording this on December 24th, Christmas Eve, Noche Buena, period. I'm truly grateful to have made it this far this year. We learned so much, and we're going to talk about everything that we learned, AJ and I. And first and foremost, I truly pray and wish everyone a safe, healthy, and comforting winter season and new year for you and all your loved ones. I'm over here joined with my loved one, Ajay Ravi Kamal. Ajay Ravi Kamal is an ENBY TransMasc mental health advocate and aspiring licensed clinical social worker. AJ is set to begin their Master of Social Work in fall 2025 at CUNY Hunter College to become a therapist and social worker dedicated to serving the QT BIPOC community. That stands for Queer and Trans, BIPOC, which is Black and Indigenous, POC, which is Person of Color, community, very long. In this podcast, AJ explores the concept of emotionally immature parents, a term introduced in Emotionally Immature Parents, a Recovery Workbook for Adult Children by Kai Tai Kevin Qiu. Tune in as AJ unpacks the harmful dynamics often present in childhood, empowers listeners to reclaim their adult lives, and provides tools for setting healthy boundaries moving forward. So before we start, I want to get us situated with some expectations so that we have an idea of what to expect moving forward. So right after this, we're going to have more conversations with AJ as he expands more about himself and why he does what he does. Then we're going to transition to having a conversation about 3 critical frameworks, biopolitics, critical race theory, and post-structuralism, where we're going to talk more about why these are going to be used as essentially like as a tool to analyze the lived experiences that AJ talks about throughout the podcast. Then after that, AJ is going to give us a nice little description of Chapter 2, which is the foundation of this podcast episode, Chapter 2 of Emotionally Immature Parents. And there he's going to give us more contextual evidence. So before we talk about personal experiences, we're going to dive deeper into the context, right? The evidence, the academic resources, so that we all have a foundation, right? We're all on the same page. So moving forward, we're going to then talk about AJ's lived experiences and how that ties into the 4 concepts that he talks about throughout Chapter 2. And then finally, we're going to close it out. We're going to give some healthy coping mechanisms, because we can't leave this podcast without leaving you guys with some healthy coping mechanisms, some healthy coping strategies, so that everyone can leave with this feeling fulfilled, but also feeling knowledgeable, right? We don't want folks to feel, depressed or anxious or, scared that their parent might be an emotionally immature parent. We want you to look at this at a proactive level and at a mature level. At the end of the day, it's not your fault. It's not even your parents' fault. This society that we live in, this capitalist society, is very difficult, and it has a lot of pressures on all of us. There's a lot of pressures on all of us to be a certain way, and that's something that can take a toll on anybody. So that's something that we also have to hold space for. This is not an opportunity to just start clapping back at our parents and this, that, and the third. That's not the message here. The message here is that we need to heal, but in order to heal, we need to understand our history. And to understand our history, we need to understand our parents' history and our parents' history. And that's on period. So that being said, there's going to be some trigger warnings. We're going to talk about suicide, suicidal ideation, sexual violence, domestic violence, grape, and other things. So please take care of yourself. Visit www.lareinataina.com/SOS. I updated my SOS page, so please go check out my website at www.lareinataina.com/SOS so that you or a loved one can find support and guidance during these trying times. Furthermore, we're going to be relaxing. It's December 24th, as mentioned. So we're really going to kick it and relax. We're going to be smoke-a-doking. We're going to be drinking. So if you partake and you wish to join, please join us in this relaxing conversation and this freeing, vulnerable, communal conversation regarding healing and emotionally immature parents. For those that don't partake in those activities, please bring your coffee, bring your hot cocoa, your hot chocolate, bring your tea. I love me a good oolong tea. Yes sir. Love me a good little oolong tea for sure. So bring anything warm, anything cozy, and let's just sit around the campfire, right? Let's be in community as our indigenous ancestors once did. Shall we, darling? The last episode, we had the pleasure of listening to my beautiful sister, Agatha Brooks, share her art and her lived experience with us. Thank you, Agatha, for your candor, for your vulnerability, and your resilience. We receive your art with awe and respect. We receive you with love and care. You are an inspiration to all trans and NB people, especially trans women of color. Speaking of trans of color, I'd love to turn it over to Ajay Ravi Kamal so that he may share more about himself and what he's all about. AJ?
Hey everyone, thanks Reina. This is AJ, pronouns he, they. It's nice to meet everyone. And just a little more about my story. I'm on my own journey of healing, which started in therapy right before the end of 2020. And, I've delved into my childhood trauma and on trying to understand, where it came from, how to heal from it, how to cope. And, my awesome therapist recommended a book to me, which was mentioned earlier. And it's called Emotionally Immature Parents, again, by Dr. Kai Tai Kevin Qiu. And, we're going to link that in the bio if anybody's curious about buying it. But, yeah, just a little more about that, that's where I learned about emotionally immature parents. And fun fact, emotionally immature parents, while I was reading the book, that term, I decided to say EEP. Fun fact, was the inspiration for Reina's latest release, Emotional Immature Parents. Go listen to it right now. It's out on all streaming platforms. Again, we're going to link that in the bio. And yes, REINA TAÍNA. Y'all need to listen to the queen. Anyway, so a little more about who am I, what do I do, what is it that I want to do, and why. I want to tell all of you a little bit more about my inspirations. As Reina mentioned, I want to go into the mental health field, and I want to just serve the community in the way that my therapist has served me. It sounds a little cliche, but there's such a dire need right now for cutie BIPOC therapists because of the, increasing suicide rate. Trigger warning. Sorry.
I'm going to put a trigger warning before. Don't worry, y'all. I got y'all.
Okay. The increasing suicide rate, which is happening right now in the United States. And, that is, of course, also in relation to all of the hundreds of legislation bills that are being introduced to the Congress because of our, newly elected president. But we won't go more into that. That's a different podcast episode, right now?
Mm-hmm.
So, speaking of suicide, that is part of the inspiration, right? And to what I mean by that is, I remember when I was back in college at Hunter College in Upper East Side, New York. I remember looking up the suicide rates globally and finding out that, if you didn't know, I'm Indo-Caribbean. my parents are from Guyana. I was born in New York, but still proudly Guyanese and still proudly Indo-Caribbean, acknowledging my Indian roots. So when we talk about India and we talk about the slave trade, we have to acknowledge that the Caribbean was the destination for most of the slaves that were taken from Africa, right? Mm-hmm. Which relates to one of the main themes of this podcast, right, Reina, which is biopolitics, right? Yeah. Biopolitics, literally the moving and shipping and selling of black and brown bodies over the Atlantic, right? Yeah. And so what is the point of me saying all of this, right? I'm trying to say Guyana, for a few years, I actually am not sure right now. I'm going to have to double check. Maybe I'll do some pausing and do some research, but Guyana had the highest suicide rate per capita in the world, actually. Which is a devastating fact to know. Very difficult, to read, knowing that my biological parents are literally from birthed in this country, right? This third world country, grew up in poverty, and only to also understand now as an adult that there is a global mental health crisis. And I particularly take interest in my country, which is Guyana, and why is it that there is so much desire to unalive oneself, mm-hmm. right? Why is there so much desire to not live anymore?
That's the real question.
We find, trigger warning, we find that most of the SSA acts, right, which stands for suicide attempt acts, are done by what is most available to the people of the country. And again, because it's a third world country, or, actually it's a developing country, there's a lot of farmers, right? There's a lot of agriculture. There's a lot of markets where they sell these produce. And therefore, on these farms, they have access to a lot of pesticides. So unfortunately, pesticides are one of the things that are used, right? Poison. You hear, from old folk tales, folklore, from my culture, Indian wives' tales or Guyanese wives' tales. You hear that it's voodoo or obia, as we say, that is causing so many people to want to, unalive themselves. Causing people to unalive themselves is from, some negative energy, demonic, praising and things like that, which often are actually, have underlying racial implications towards, like, the indigenous mm-hmm. communities and, yep. Like, our peoples that were displaced, taken, our people that faced genocide, before America was formed, North America. Knowing that people from, certain poor parts of India, like Uttar Pradesh, or, otherwise known as UP, and Calcutta, the darker skinned people, the poor people, they were the ones that were taken and, again, brought to the Caribbean amongst various islands, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana primarily. And then after the indentured servants contracts were over, they eventually ended up spreading over to the rest of the Caribbean, which was, which includes but not limited to Barbados, Turks and Caicos, Grenada. And so, again, we continue to ask ourselves, why is this mental health crisis prevalent, particularly in this country? Why is this statistic here? Why? And, all I can think about is something that I often talk to you about, Reina, and it's white supremacy, right? And it's imperialism, and it's colonization, and it's racism. It's the desire to be dominant over one other. And that happens to be those with darker skin, those with more melanin in their skin, right? And we know that because of, this anthropologist, right? Or, so when did you say it was created? This
In Portugal.
In Portugal.
Oh, yeah, in the 1400s. The whole creation of race and how this whole idea of like the heart of darkness, which a lot of people refer to at the time. Joseph Conrad is the author that actually wrote the book Heart of Darkness, where essentially they go into the Congo actually and discover like all these riches and ta. And long story short, Europe at the time was popping and Portugal at the time was not popping, so they were trying to find a way to get popping with them. And essentially they had explorers and scientists and stuff essentially create this scientific experiment to prove that those humans that existed in Africa were actually underdeveloped and did not have the capacity to be as evolved and as civil as Europeans, and that
and the justifications were like their craniotomy, right? Like their brain sizes, their skull structures, right? This is early anthropology, early very racist anthropology, father of anthropology, unfortunately.
In the 1400s.
Right. But now we know better. Right, so why am I saying this? It's generational trauma. And if those of you listening don't know what that is, generational trauma is essentially the passing of generations of torture and displacement and loss of family and familiarity, which familiarity equals safety. We all know that, right? So we can imagine what that does to one. I mean, I can't even imagine that, right? Like, I grew up in such a privileged life, right? Like, we don't even realize that until we read the history that we aren't taught in schools, right? And so being taken from your homeland, being sold lies, only to come and realize, like, I'm getting paid, but I'm getting paid pennies. I'm getting housing, but it's really not suitable for living. And that drugs are being pumped into my community, alcohol, things of that sort. And, you see things like alcoholism on the rise, and that is also coupled with domestic violence, more abuse. There's a lot more strict gender roles, which, are there because of many things, right? Because of coloniality, imperialism, and things of that sort. So, you can imagine why there may be people who feel like they need to unalive themselves, right? And something Reina and I talk about a lot is that, like, if you don't feel safe in a space, right? The body, the mind, the spirit, the soul, they want to...
It breaks. It cracks.
They break, they crack. They don't feel like they can survive. And so what happens, they self-destruct, right? And what are we talking about? We're talking about that SI, right? That ideation to unalive oneself. That desire to not be here anymore, because the fact that I was taken from my home, the fact that we came here and we have such harsh living conditions, and the fact that women are being abused not only by their own husbands, but also by those that sold us this dream, right? The white man. So when we talk about men and we talk about the dynamics that are established from and between women and men, we talk about gender roles, and these things are engineered into us as children, fortified generation after generation. It's hard. It's really difficult to unlearn, right? But us, we Gen Z, we are trying to do our best to change that, right? And so I find that even in my own experience, right, my, close family relatives, even I, were subject to those same gender roles that were, right, subjugated to my great grandparents, my ancestors, and things of that sort. And, coupled with that, I also saw the trauma. Along with all of the other things, right? The good things, the good traits, right? The culture that fortunately was able to be passed down through generations, because it wasn't actually taken from us, versus, right, many African countries, many African people were not allowed to practice their own culture and languages and things of that sort, right? And of course, we see these changes happen when slavery becomes legal, right? In the year
around the 1800s.
Yeah. So.
Oh, 1864? I don't know. I forget it.
Yeah.
That sounds familiar. 1864, 1867.
They have to find new workers. They have to find new people to control, because now they can't, for the people that they've already taken from the African slave trade, right? So they decide, okay, let's go to India, right? This is said before already. So sorry for the redundancy. And so, so this is my inspiration, right? My inspiration is literally firsthand seeing this trauma passed down to my own parents and siblings and cousins and everybody, right? And, that's not to specifically call out anybody that may be listening to this podcast, but just acknowledging that there is this crisis, this invisible crisis, this non-tangible crisis that, unfortunately, because it's not tangible, we don't take it as seriously as a broken arm or a broken leg, right? But in reality, we need to be physically healthy and emotionally and mentally healthy equally. None takes precedent over the other, So, we need to bring a bigger awareness onto this crisis, right, in this community, and how it's affected our own personal lives. For me personally, my family, unfortunately, is not able to digest that I can, by choice, be a trans man. And, that's just realities that a lot of trans BIPOC folk face. And again, what's to blame. It's white supremacy.
Thank you so much, love. Thank you so much for sharing more about your inspiration and why you're here today. I think something that's really important to take away is mental health is a serious, serious crisis. It's an epidemic around the world, period. That's it. And because of all of the amazing information that AJ gave us, we essentially gonna break it down more for you.
So tell us a little more, Reina.
Yeah, so a little bit more about these critical frameworks. Essentially, real quick, when we're talking about critical frameworks and critical thought, we're essentially saying that when it comes to understanding the world around us, we understand that it comes in many layers. It's like Shrek said, right? An onion. He's an onion. We all onions in many different ways. That Shrek reference, That's how old we are. But anyways, and because there are so many layers, it's important to understand how not only that every layer exists, but that they all work in tandem with each other to impact the very decisions that we make, right? To limit it, to restrict it, or to give it more freedom. So that is something that's really important, because when you think about, for example, detectives, right, or the FBI, right, like, you need to have critical thought, right, in order to solve the problem, in order to solve the crime. You can't just be like, oh, surface level, oh, I think he did it. No. You got to ask the questions. You got to think outside the box. You got to already have information beforehand about the situation, about the area. That's what makes someone really, really good at critical thought. So there's different frameworks, different categories of critical thought. And we're going to focus on 3 because we believe that these 3 really capture the conversations that we're going to be having regarding our lived experiences later in this episode. And the following are biopolitics, critical race theory, and post-structuralism. We're going to start off by me reading the definitions, and I'm going to pass it over to AJ for him to read more about the historical context of each of the terms, because I think it's really important for us to really understand where these words came from and why it's so important in today's day and age. Alright, so let's jump in. So for biopolitics, the definition of biopolitics is the idea that governments or other authorities control people's lives and bodies, not just through laws, but also by regulating things like health, reproduction, and even life expectancy. It looks at how power is used to shape how people live, age, and die.
Yeah. So, hey y'all, it's AJ again. So, a little bit about the historical context of biopolitics, which was a term which was coined by Michel Foucault in the late 20th century. For my fellow sociology majors, you know Foucault. But who is Foucault? He was a philosopher that explored modern states and how they exert control over populations. And not just through legal systems, but by regulating aspects of life like health, birth rates, and death. And, the rise of biopolitics reflects a shift in power, where rulers not only govern through laws, but also shape how people live, feel, and even how their bodies function. Its impact today can be seen in debates around things like healthcare, reproductive rights, and the surveillance of public health crises, showing how deeply politics can penetrate our personal and bodily freedoms. And, I feel like this is just, wow, like, all I can think about is my lived experience as a cutie BIPOC person, right? And that's living in the United States during this current political climate. And our bodies are policed, whether, listeners believe it or not, right? Let's talk about how much legislation, has been introduced to police our bodies. Specifically, how can we play sports? How can we pee? How can we take a poop? Right?
A poop.
A shit. A caca. When it's like in reality, and when we're home, right? When we're with family, me and Reina, we use the same bathroom.
Mm-hmm. There's only one bathroom.
The fuck is the difference? Why can't we have gender neutral bathrooms outside, right? Mm-hmm. And we're not asking for this to be done in the snap of a finger, but what we're asking for is for this to at least be a normalcy, right? Because we have to remember that this system that we live in is not binary, right? We were taught that, which is a very structuralist mindset, right? Very structuralist way of thinking, which is like what is definitely taught in public media, which is definitely taught in schools today. But nonetheless, we need to remember that all bodies are created equal, all bodies matter, and that no body, whether you are a cis woman who, has the choice to do in vitro, whether you are a person who wants to, have an abortion for health reasons, your child, has a very low expectancy to or viable life expectancy upon birth, and so things of that sort, or even like victims of unfortunate events, right? And so you want to remember that we live in a country right now that unfortunately is policing our bodies, but we have to remember that we have bodily autonomy. Like we have control over our bodies. We're gonna fight back, and we're gonna, we're definitely gonna try to fight to implement a post structuralist approach. And, passing it back over to Reina to talk about post-structuralism and critical race theory. Right back to you.
Thank you, my love. So, into critical race theory. Critical race theory, or CRT, is an academic framework that examines how race and racism shape laws, systems, and policies in society. It argues that racism is not just an individual act, but is built into the structure of society, often in ways people don't notice.
Yes. And, if in case you didn't know, critical race theory and the teaching of this theory and this, very important framework is being banned in certain states. Which is very, very concerning, right? And it's concerning because it is literally a theory that addresses racial inequities, very real racial inequities, right? A theory that was developed, in other words, a theory that emerged in the United States during the late 20th century, developed by legal scholars like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, which, if you, if that name rings a bell, she created the intersectionality theory, actually. And also Richard Delgado. They were, responding to what they saw as failures of traditional civil rights laws. And, they wanted to just address these racial inequities. CRT, which is critical race theory, emphasizes that race is indeed a social construct, not just a biological fact, and that laws and institutions are often designed to maintain racial inequities, right? And we can think of these institutions like schools and hospitals and things of that sort. And, this construct has influence not just nationally, but internationally, right? We see this construct around the world, and it's utilized in systems of oppression like education, criminal justice, and public policy, sparking debates about equity, inclusion, and justice worldwide.
Thank you, love. So now on to post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is a theory in philosophy and sociology that challenges traditional ideas about how we understand truth, meaning, and identity. It argues that meaning is not fixed, and that ideo-colonial is shaped by language, culture, and social context. In other words, it's skeptical of the idea that there's one true way to understand the world.
Post-structuralism developed in the 1960s and 1970s. I did mention this before, that it was a reaction against, this kind of mainstream idea that infiltrated culture, language, and society. Structuralism. And thinkers, which we mentioned before, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, were key to post-structuralist thought. They argue that meaning and identity are not stable or universal. So, post-structuralism has had a profound impact on global politics, challenging dominant ideologies by questioning the way knowledge is constructed and how power influences what we know to be true, right? Like, do we really have control of what we learn? Do we really have control of what we intake in media, on social media, on the news, in those newspapers, right? Post-structuralism has played a major role. Post-structuralism has played a major role in feminist theory, decolonial studies, and postmodern thought. transforming how people view identity and power in society. And, Reina and I talk about post-structuralism a lot, which is, it's a very high level, sort of philosophy and theory, but it's the future, right? It's what we see in, certain dystopian books such as Woman on the Edge of Time, which I actually read in college in one of my very first classes, Women in Gender Studies 101. And that book is by, I want to say, Marge Piercy. And it talks about a certain dystopian life that she's able to kind of time travel to the year 2137, I believe it is. Let me just take a look and see. I wrote down some bullet points here. 2137, I believe. And essentially, like, they were able to time travel to a time in society where, which was in the future in 2137. And essentially, there was this decentralization of power, decentralization of these very structuralist and oppression entities. And one of them was gender. And gender was ambiguous. Gender was androgynous, right? There was this character named Lucieth, which visited the main character, whom was androgynous. It was this person from the future. And essentially, they used the pronouns per, which stood for person, right? It was nothing of that sort. He, she, whatever, we use today, it was non-existent. And, we do know that gender is indeed a social construct because it is, it is a construct. It is a thing, an entity, a phenomenon that has changed over time. And something that is permanent, that is actually, a part of our life and is correct, is not going to change over time. That's a construct. That's a social construct. So, if you want to check out this book, we're going to link it in the bottom of the, in the description on the website. It's a really interesting book, honestly. If you want to read about a book where a society, a utopian society where they focus on, just diversity and equity and a world where we allow children to be themselves and know themselves and listen to their hearts and follow it.
Amazing. Now let's dive into this podcast episode, because I know a lot of our listeners right now are probably like, what the hell is an emotionally immature parent? What is an EAP? Let's dive into that a little bit more. So this section that we have here, we're going to be specifically focusing on chapter 2 of the Emotionally Immature Parents book, because we believe it does a really good job at just giving like the fundamentals and kind of like almost a how-to of how to understand and even identify an EAP. So we're going to break it down into 4 concepts: emotional vulnerability, role reversal, lack of empathy, and repeating the cycle. So we're going to have AJ, since y'all hear my voice every single time in all these episodes, we're going to have AJ take the lead on this one. And different from before, we're going to be having it be a little bit more lax, more chill. As I mentioned prior, we're going to be smoking, we're going to be doing our thing, because we want to make sure that this next section, us talking about our lived experiences, is as authentic and as real as we can make it, because at the end of the day, we some authentic bitches, period. Entonces, sí. So what we're going to do so that everyone can follow along, we're going to have one concept be talked about, and we're going to talk about it real quick in an academic sense so that we can have some foundation, some grounding. And we're going to have AJ do that. He's going to give us a quote, and he's going to give us maybe a little word or two some more stuff within the actual book. So he's gonna also tell you like which pages. So in case you have it, you could also find it as a PDF online. But in case you have it, you can follow along because we'll be sharing the page number as well. And the way that will work, he'll do the academic concepts and then he'll jump into his personal experiences, and then I'll just like add a little bit of my stuff, my little sauce and pepper. But you know, y'all know my life. Y'all know my life. But yeah, just to add more context, because I think it's really important to juxtapose both of our lived experiences because there's a lot of similarities and differences. And at the same time, it really underscores how prevalent these issues are for cutie BIPOC, specifically for trans people of color. So I'm gonna pass it over to my boy, Ajay Ravi Kamal.
What's up, y'all? This is AJ again. So, talking about chapter 2, which is page 21 in the book, Emotionally Immature Parents. They talk about one of the key concepts, emotional vulnerabilities. How children of emotionally immature parents often feel invisible and unsupported, and so if we reference page 22, where under the section of trauma, paragraph 2, it says, as the child of an emotionally immature parent, it is likely you didn't have the support you deserve in your time of need. As a result, you ended up with unprocessed feelings that remain inside you. These difficult and intense emotions then continue to come up when a present event triggers you. For example, as an adult, you may find yourself in an argument in which the other person raises their voice, which then triggers you to remember your parents fighting, right? Often your parent who is emotionally immature is not able to validate a traumatic experience, right? And traumatic experiences can vary and are very, unique to everyone's life and perspective, right? But these traumatic and intense feelings need to be, mirrored through your parent and validated and seen. And if it's not, you're left with things like PTSD. You're left with things like CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We develop negative and unhealthy coping mechanisms, where we might choose to appease and accommodate others to avoid conflicts, often, avoiding your own needs and neglecting yourself just to appease others, because that's how you find yourself, your self-worth, because your parents told you that's how you find your self-worth. Moving on to my own experiences, right, as a child of a emotionally immature parent. I can think of times where my parent should have comforted me, in times where it was clear that, I wasn't in the wrong in a situation. I in fact shouldn't have been held accountable because I was a child. But my emotionally immature parent is stunted in the mindset of a child, and therefore is not able to see that a child should not take on that responsibility of a parent, right? And so, let's say things like bullying, right? I remember things like bullying not being validated. I remember things like, traumatic experience with relationships and other types of encounters were not validated or, seen. And validation may comes in many forms, which is like showing empathy through an emotional response, a hug, crying, verbal validation, right? Saying it, giving you contact, physical contact, affection, making you feel safe, right? Your parent cannot do that because you can't expect something from them that they did not receive from their parents because they are incapable of doing it. And that is definitely something that is really hard to accept, right, as children of emotionally immature parents. Mm-hmm. And that's why I find myself with this workbook, right, accepting that my needs were not met by my parent, whose needs were also not met by their parents, whose needs were also not met by their parents, and et cetera, right?
The cycle goes on.
I mentioned being stunted, as a child. And, essentially, you're two children, right? Your parent is a child, you are a child. And, this kind of, takes us into the next bullet point, or the next critical key concept from Chapter 2, which is called role reversal, which is the idea that children may take on the emotional burden of their parents, leaving their own emotional needs unmet. And this does sound similar to the first bullet point, but bullet point 2, I can think of things I've gone through that, like for instance, seeing my parents in very vulnerable, spaces, very vulnerable states that was very childlike. I couldn't help but feel like I needed to comfort them. I needed to become their parent. And therefore, I've neglected my own needs to, lessen the emotional burden my parents have that they didn't realize they have, right? And that's role reversal. And because of this neglect to yourself, you essentially begin to repeat your parents' relationship dynamics, right? So, role reversal ties into the concept of arrested development, which can be found on page 23 of the book. And it essentially talks about a child's needs of receiving empathy and feeling unconditionally loved, safe, and like they belong in their family. When this essential need is not met by their family, they don't develop properly into an adult. This leads into something called arrested development, right? It's not just a TV show, guys. But yeah, arrested development, right? As it makes sense, right? Because of the name arrested development. It means someone is grown up, but they show signs of maturity, right? We can hear in the word, your development was arrested, right? Mm-hmm. Your development was stunted. Your development has been held back.
Yeah, hindered.
Trapped. Not able to move, right? Mm-hmm. And so, what can I think about for my parents? What can I think about for not just my parents, but my family, all types of family, right? Not just trying to single out parents, grandparents, all of these types of people who were results of, all of my family from Guyana. And so I can think about a lot of times where I was super worried about family members, particularly those older than me that are the caregivers. I remember reversing the role of me being the child, but I'm the parent. I'm worried about them. I'm wondering where they are. They were supposed to be home at 10 o'clock. It's 10:05 and I'm worried as if I'm the parent, right? But that's not my job, right? or that's not any child's job. A child should not be worrying about their parent, but instead, it's a parent's job to worry about a child, right? A child needs to be a child. A child should live their life feeling safe so that their development is not arrested. And something that arrested development also causes is a lack of empathy, which is another key concept in Chapter 2, which is the emotional alienation children experience when their needs are not validated. And essentially, you may fall and hit your knee on the concrete and run to your parents or your caregiver for, comfort, but they're like, man up, right? That's lack of empathy, right? Some may say that's trying to develop your little, your son into a real man, but in reality, that's toxic, and, it is a lack of empathy. Your child cannot heal correctly from traumatic experiences if you do not provide them empathy. And empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's perspectives and understand other person's feelings. How does your actions, behaviors, words affect another person's feelings? Well, you don't really care about that if you don't have the ability to empathize. I remember, in family fights, certain things are said to you that, it's really hard to forget. And honestly, I'm guilty of the same. I've said things that I regret saying, but emotionally immature parents particularly say really harsh things, and they aren't able to understand how it hurts their children. My family isn't really, or my caregivers who may be EAPs are not able to understand why being trans is so important to me. Why, living in a world that is so riddled with transphobia causes me to have the anger that I have. Especially when I come from a family that doesn't necessarily know how to provide empathy to their trans child, So, this leads me into number 4, key concept, repeating the cycle, right? And repeating the cycle essentially means, the child of the emotionally immature parent essentially is going to repeat the same emotional dynamic that they had with their parent in their own adulthood. So in other words, if I'm a child of an EAP, I'm going to grow up and essentially repeat the same exact behaviors my parents did or my caregivers did. And things, where can we find some textual evidence for this is on page 25 under the second section for repeating your parents' relationship dynamics, right? As an adult, you might notice yourself entering relationships with others who are emotionally immature. It makes sense because this is the dynamic that was modeled to you as a child by your parent. You may even find some comfort in this kind of relationship because it is what you know. In these repeated dynamics, you likely continue to base your self-worth on how good you are at neglecting your own needs and taking care of or rescuing the other person. And so essentially, you think you need to work hard for someone's attention. You need to work hard for someone's affection. And this, in fact, is not true, right? We as adults of EAPs, we may find partners whom we overexert ourselves for, right? We give more than we actually should because we find our self-worth in these actions. And, you may have found your parent You know, when let's see, when they're upset with you or they're upset, they cook more, right? To console you instead of talking. And so you might do the same thing, right? You might end up, you know, you're fighting with your partner. You might end up cleaning their clothes. You may end up making their favorite meal. You may end up, you know, like going out and getting their favorite treat. Overexerting yourself, right? Maybe if that person hurt you, even if that person was mean to you or disrespected or even harmed you, because you are, you know, you don't have a good sense of self or confidence, you're gonna accept this harm. And unfortunately, you know, I myself have experienced this in my own relationships, right? And you know, thankfully I've been able to exit those relationships and heal, but unfortunately it was something that I did experience.
Thank you so much, AJ. I really appreciate all of your wisdom and your expertise on this matter. And now, moving forward, we want to hold space to share some healing and coping strategies, specifically for children and young adults of emotionally immature parents. And for starters, want to make sure to let everyone know that a PDF version is going to be attached to my website, www.lareinataina.com. And it's going to be under the VAMOS HABLAR INGLÉS section. And there's a little Q section where I'm always have different resources that I talk about, you know, MLA citations. So if you ever want to know anything that like I'm talking about in any of these episodes, you can always refer to my website. I try my best to, you know, show the textbooks, the journals that I share, that I talk about, because, you know, we can't just be talking out our ass. We educated human beings over here. So we have 8 different types of healing and coping strategies that we want to share with you. And then AJ and I are going to go into how we kind of apply this and implement this in our lives. So, number 1, community and collective healing, cultural reconnection and identity affirmation, mindfulness and emotional regulation, setting boundaries and self-care, seeking professional support, engaging in creative expression, participating in restorative practices, building supportive networks. So those are the 8. And yeah, I feel like I could start off, like, for example, like cultural reconnection and identity affirmation. That absolutely speaks to me reconnecting with my Taino roots and proudly being an official member. Happy to say that. Official member of my tribal family. And that is an example of healing and coping strategies, because I'm using this as a strategy to reconnect myself with my inner child and to heal and soothe my inner child, the screaming, the grieving. Because at the end of the day, for me personally, as you guys know, it's all in the root chakra for me. It's all about family and stability. That's something that I lacked a lot. Even though I had a lot of family, I feel like I did it. And that's real. I know a lot of people can feel that, can relate to that. How about you, AJ?
You know, number 1, community and collective healing as a form of coping and healing as, you know, children and adults of EAPS. I find myself trying to find more community to collectively heal with my cutie BIPOC siblings. I have been in connection, thanks to REINA, to and with folk that are, you know, within the cutie BIPOC community in India, in Germany, in, you know, other parts of Asia, and so on and so forth. Not to include the Caribbean, right? Dominican Republic, and
Yeah.
Also, moving on to number 3.
Yeah.
We have REINA.
Yeah. I mean, we can just go around. I think another one for me that speaks to me is Definitely engaging in creative expression, like 100%. I see myself when I'm, writing raps and I'm in the shower dancing. I'm really in my element, and it's something that it's really the best medicine. There's nothing really that calms me down, especially during a manic episode, like art. And that's for real.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm actually trying to lean a little more into that. Um, Seeking professional support, of course, I always encourage folks that, believe therapy works for them, to find therapists, whether you want to find a music therapist, a psychotherapist, or, whatever your preference may be, EMDR. I personally have found therapy very, very, very helpful to me. Medication therapy and also talk therapy and other forms of therapy. I encourage all of you, of course, if it's affordable, right, to seek professional support. I also find setting boundaries and practicing self-care to be one of the most profound, you know, positive impacting things that you can do to cope and heal. Me and Reina like to do masks a lot, whether it's in person or virtual.
Mm-hmm.
We exercise, journal, again, creative expression, dance. That is also a form of self-care, a bath. And setting boundaries, which can be really hard, especially as a child, an adult of an EAP. But that is so important, right, Reina?
100%. Yeah, so definitely, again, www.larenataina.com/VHI-podcast. Alright, so we made it to the conclusion of our podcast. We want to do some final reflections, some key takeaways, reflecting on breaking cycles of emotional neglect and creating healthier relationships. Out of everything you talked about, AJ, since you the expert, you were here, again, thank you so much for coming. What are some final reflections, final thoughts, or just anything, any words you want to share with the group?
I just encourage all of you that are embarking on this journey, this healing journey, to explore, your own trauma and heal your inner child. Just be patient with yourself. Definitely, check out Reina's PDF with the healing and coping strategies, whatever works for you. And I definitely, if you're ready, recommend reading this book. This book was really transformative for me. And, it is a book that will take time to read because it is a lot to digest, and it's very awakening for us as adult children of emotionally immature parents. So, just, everyone, be patient with yourself, take care of yourselves, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, love. And to echo everything that AJ was just talking about, I definitely want to hold some space, as I always do, to really acknowledge that everything that we talk about in my podcast can be very academically heavy. And I want folks to understand that it's not to discourage nobody, it's to encourage people, especially people of color, especially people that, they want to learn. They street scholars, right? Maybe they don't have a GED, they don't have their high school education, maybe they didn't finish college. At the end of the day, education should be accessible to everybody, and that's the whole point of this conversation. That's the whole point of this podcast. And the reason why I'm doing it in such an academic way is because as a person, as an alumni, right, from an Ivy League, and understanding all these inequities among brown and black and white people and indigenous people, I understand that, like, we gotta give each other 100%. And if I'm over here getting the keys to the kingdom over here at these Ivy Leagues, I gotta show you how to, get the keys to the kingdom. I gotta give y'all the keys to the kingdom. I gotta give y'all the ingredients to make the cake. You feel me? Like, we really gotta do this. And just like making the cake, right? Like, it's many layers. There's a lot of steps. But with time and with practice, you're gonna understand it, take the time after this, like, really take the time. You know, be silent, look around in the world around you. Really take your time. And, for example, play a game with yourself. Challenge yourself. For one day, pretend that you're in a Black Mirror show, okay? Pretend that everything around you is completely fake. Why? Because it'll teach you to understand social constructs. It'll teach you to understand that you really can't believe what your eyes see, you know? And also, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. That's something that's the big final takeaway right there. So yes, mi gente. Gracias, mi gente, for listening. Make sure to follow my podcast and turn on that notification button so you can be the first to listen to my upcoming podcast. Make sure to also give me a follow on my Instagram at GamoIsNotDead_ and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Gamo, aka La Reina Taína. Also, I want to highlight to go visit my SOS page on my website, www.larenataina.com/SOS, so that you can see the updated version. I added some more resources and some links and stuff so that we can have a little more holistic approach to all these resources for mental support, mental health support, physical support, all that stuff, community building. And for anyone listening, if you have any resources that you think would be valuable to the community, please share it with me so that I can add it. This is a living document. I've been working this with different people. I've had actually random people email me and, you know, give me ideas. So please do. I definitely take it, I receive it, because we want to grow, right? We want to make all of this information as accessible as possible. Because just like AJ said, like, there's a lot of people that unalive themselves, and we have to really understand why that is. And the truth is, it's because no one's listening to them. We need to listen to each other. And one way to do that is to understand post-structuralism, understand critical race theory, understand biopolitics. And specifically with CRT, removing the politics from it, 100%. Yeah, it is political history, but removing your own political biases from the conversation, because it's not about whether you believe in abortion or not, or Trump supporter or whatever. It's about respect and building a culture of respect. At the end of the day, we not only live in the same country, but we live in the same planet, in the same motherfucking solar system, alright? And we ain't going nowhere. Besides the fact that Elon Musk talking about let's go to Mars, he can go to Mars. We ain't going nowhere, okay? So because we're not going nowhere and we're going to be here for a minute, let's learn to respect each other. Let's learn to get along, because that's how we do this. And how we do this is by sharing knowledge for free. It's about having these dialogues and these conversations, inviting more guest speakers into my podcast so we can have different perspectives. You already got 3 perspectives from trans people of color. Caribbean trans people of color. You got the Bahamas with Agatha, you got the Dominican Republic with me, and you got Guyana with AJ. Take your notes. Take some pages from our book. Because at the end of the day, it's about respect, it's about love. This is the VAMOS HABLAR INGLÉS Podcast. I'm your host, La Reina Taína, and as always, vete con Dios, y que Dios te da amor, sabiduría y salud. Mwah.
No pasa nada, yo veo agua, meneo culito como Tyler, amor profundo como Haya, flow psicopata como Arda.